Welcome back. So our second presenter for the evening is Dr. Kenneth Brown, who is an assistant professor of philosophy here at Cal Poly. He received his PhD in philosophy at UC Irvine and teaches ancient Greek philosophy, modern rationalism, modern empiricism, as well as philosophical classics. He will be presenting his talk, Virtual Persons. Can what we don't know about ourselves help us design better artificial persons? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming out. I'm here to talk about virtual persons, and I'm qualifying this by calling them Lockean virtual persons. We'll make a little bit more sense out of that in a moment. Of course, the function of this whole enterprise is to address the question of what it is to be a human. And I'm going to reformulate that question, though, into what it means to be a person. And the reason why I'm reformulating this is that the inquiry into what we are conceived of as an inquiry into what it is to be a person comes from this gentleman, John Locke, and his book, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. As you can see, it's pretty old, 17th century here. John Locke wrote his essay in 1689, and actually in the second edition of the essay added a discussion of identity. And in this discussion of identity, raised some questions about what we are and what we conceive ourselves to be, and launched the inquiry into personal identity. This is a recent quote from a philosopher named Sidney Shoemaker, who says that it's been said by actually a guy named Alfred North Whitehead, that the history of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. Whatever truth there may be in this, there is surely much more truth in the claim that the history of the topic of personal identity has been a series of footnotes to Locke. That John Locke started the inquiry into the account of what it is to be a person that set the agenda for this study ever afterwards. Locke's primary intuition is that a person is not a body. And what I mean by this is that what it is to be a person is not just to have this physical form. Now, there was a long-standing tradition going way back to ancient philosophers like Aristotle to try to understand the human being as an animal type, as a type that has a certain organic structure, and also to understand our cognitive capabilities in relation to those organic structures. What Locke claimed was that a person is not just that organic structure. It's something else entirely different from merely having a certain kind of organic structure. Another idea that people had pursued for a long time was that maybe a person isn't their body, but is instead an immaterial soul that is in some way related to that body. John Locke also said a person's not a soul either. That really wasn't quite an inflammatory claim. But the claim that we're going to be dealing with most particularly tonight is the issue about persons and bodies. And so I just want to follow up on this theme. Now, given what Sidney Shoemaker had said, that a person, or that the study of personal identity is a series of footnotes to Locke, well, one upshot of that is that there are quite a lot of philosophers who have been dealing with this topic, and much of what I'm presenting for you tonight is not terribly novel in that what I'm doing is trying to bring you into that study as well. But there will be a few things about how I'm presenting Locke's account that I think are novel, and its peculiar application is going to be, I think, a bit more novel. But we'll get into that in a moment. One thing that Locke did with respect to making the claim that persons are not their bodies is to provide a series of thought experiments that tried to break the connection between a person and a body. The way to make this, to break this connection for Locke was to think about a person as swapping their body. We can understand this in some recent fiction, let's say recent for philosophers, let's say over the past 100 years, about Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, where Gregor Samsa wakes up and finds that he's a beetle. His body is comprehensively transformed, yet it's still Gregor Samsa who's thinking about the previous day and worried about whether or not he's going to get in trouble with his boss for being late because he's now slept in. Yet he's coming to realize that his body doesn't work the way it used to. He's now lying on his back like that. Anyhow, that kind of fictitious story is something that Locke was talking about a few centuries earlier, wondering about human beings actually swapping their identities. And so this account of what a person is that Locke developed as divorced from the concept of what it is to be a body was motivated by a number of bizarre science fiction type thought experiments which Locke felt the need to apologize for. So he says here in this passage, and the little funny notation down there just identifies where exactly this is in his gigantic essay concerning human understanding. He says, I am apt enough to think that I have, in treating this subject, made some suppositions that will look strange to some readers, that people may swap their souls or swap their minds. And possibly they are so in themselves, but yet I think they are such as are pardonable in this ignorance we are in the nature of that thinking thing that is in us and which we look on as ourselves. It's that last remark, I think, that's really interesting. I know that I think, but I don't know what it is in me that's doing that thinking. I know that I think, but what exactly is it in me that's doing the thinking? Even if I think that the thing in me that's thinking is a body, I surely don't know how. And no scientist who studies cognition, the nature of the brain, knows how either. We may be able to correlate certain changes in the body and certain functions in the body with other factors in our thought, but what actually is that connection? Totally mysterious. We don't know. Locke made this point perspicuous. I'm going to call the way in which Locke made this point perspicuous his causal neutrality. He's causally neutral with respect to what it is to be a person. So Locke's going to provide for us some criteria for being a person, and that criteria is utterly neutral about whatever it is that causes one to be the person that one is. There's some value to this for our particular topic tonight. I'm talking about virtual persons. What I want to do is consider this issue about virtual persons in relation to just some criteria. Whatever meets the criteria for being a person, in circumstances in which we do not know what's causing that person, in circumstances where we have some basis for reasonable doubt or reasonable suspicion in some sense about whether the thing that we think is a person is instead the result of a simulation. Let's call that a virtual person. So if we have suspicion that the thing that appears to be a person is instead a simulation of a person, we'll just call that a virtual person. Okay? To conceive of a virtual person in that way requires us to formulate as its basis some criteria for what it is to be a person. Virtual persons in that sense are just a modification of the criteria for being a person. So, here's a statement that Locke made where he tried to define what a person is. A thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself the same thinking things in different times and places. That's the core criteria for what a person is. Now, what Locke did with this criteria is then raise questions about identity, sameness, whether a given person at one time is the same person as another person at another time. I'm not interested in the identity questions for tonight. I'm interested in the definitional questions tonight. Much of the work that Shoemaker alluded to about Locke was about the questions of identity, about what makes us be the same persons over time, or whether it's possible for us to be the same persons with other entities that we wouldn't otherwise ordinarily identify ourselves as being the same with. Like, for example, if somehow half your brain got ripped out and stuck inside another being, and yet carried with it a core set of memories that you had before, is that the same as me? I'm not worried about those kinds of questions, although many people ought to be worried about those questions. They make entertaining stories, at least, and lots of good philosophy gets done as a result of that, as well as a hell of a lot of bad philosophy. Nonetheless, That's not my agenda for tonight. I'm interested in this definition of a person as a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself in different times and places. I'm going to call a person that meets that criteria a cognitive person because it's cognitive criteria. I'll say that a cognitive person can formulate accounts, or cognitive persons can do this. They can formulate accounts of their own minds. And they can think of their own minds as being in different times and places. So I'm using this notion of a mind. Locke uses that notion of a mind, so it's not exactly hurting him to apply it here, as the thing that we're thinking about when we are thinking about our own intelligent being. When we're thinking about our own reason and reflection, we're thinking of our own minds. A cognitive person can formulate an account of that person's own mind. A cognitive person can think about their own mind. That's the thing I want you to latch on to. And they can think about it in a peculiar way, with respect to projection into other times. You can take your mind and think of your mind in another time, like what Gregor Samsa had done. When he woke up, he projected himself into the future, saying, my boss is going to kill me because I'm late again. But he also thought back about the past. That's because I'm late again, which means I was late before. And so with future projection and past recollection, Gregor Samsa is thinking of his mind, not just his body, but his mind, because he's actually separate from this body that's in him. While he's conceiving of himself as this mind, he's thinking of himself as not having the body that he has, the beetle body. So, cognitive persons can come up with an account of their own mind, they can conceive of their own minds, and project that conception of their own minds into other times and places. Now, that's not the only aspect of Locke's account of what it is to be a person. He augments that criteria for being a person with this additional criteria a little later in his chapter on identity. Self is that conscious thinking thing, whatever substance made up of, whether spiritual or material, simple or compounded, it matters not. That's his causal neutrality in action. So self is that conscious thing, whatever substance that makes it up, which is sensible or conscious of pleasure and pain, capable of happiness or misery, and so is concerned for itself as far as that consciousness extends. So there's the conception of itself in another time, and then there's concern for itself in those other times. Conception and concern, different from each other. The conception, purely cognitive. The concern involves pleasure and pain. He clarifies that this self is not some distinct concept. It's not as if he's distinguishing persons from selves. Instead, person, as I take it, is the name for this self. Wherever a man finds what he calls himself, there, I think, another may say is the same person. It is a forensic term, that's his spelling, not mine, appropriating actions and their merit. Person is a forensic term, appropriating actions and their merit, and so belongs only to intelligent agents capable of a law. He's using the concept of law in a flexible notion to apply both to legal and social settings as well as moral settings. So he would consider moral rules to be moral laws. And capable of happiness and misery. So summing this up, self is that conscious thinking thing, which is sensible or conscious of pleasure and pain, capable of happiness or misery, and so concerned for itself as far as that consciousness extends. I'll call that, for lack of a better term, responsible persons. Okay? Responsible persons differ from cognitive persons in this respect. It's an augmentation to a cognitive person. So a responsible person is a cognitive person, but it's a cognitive person that can do this extra thing, conceive of their own well-being by including pleasure and pain in their projections of their minds into other times and places. So we have a difference. Cognitive persons can think of their minds in other times and places. Responsible persons can think of their minds in other times and places in reference to pleasure and pain. That's the difference. To understand this a little further, what I want to do is consider in a rough sketch some features of the Lockean mind. Locke has a theory of mind. It comes in the form of a theory of ideas. He uses the word idea quite liberally. He uses it to cover basically anything that's a part of our experience, anything that we think of. His core claim is that this mind passively receives elemental ideas in experience. The means by which we do that, he calls sensation and reflection. When you're sensing, you're passively receiving elemental ideas of your environment. When you're reflecting, you are passively receiving elemental ideas of your thinking. And then he thinks there are certain other ideas that come along for the ride with either of those. The details about that, not important for us tonight. This part is a little bit more important, though. Oh, except for one thing. Pain and pleasure are passively received. The mind also actively constructs other ideas out of those elemental ideas. It does so by means of various mental operations, like remembering. When we remember, we got an idea, then that idea went away. Remembering is just popping it right back in. That's active. Compounding, just putting ideas together. You get an idea, you get another idea, you stuff them together, now you got a compound idea of both parts. Comparing, that's where we get relations. So an idea comes in, and then another idea comes in, and then another idea comes in, and we get an idea of temporal ordering. Temporal ordering comes from comparing. We got an idea here, we got an idea there, we got another idea here. We work up ideas of spatial relations. On this account, spatial relations and temporal relations are projected. So think about the cognitive mind for a moment. The cognitive mind includes projections of the mind into other times and places. That requires comparing, because it requires the construction of spatiotemporal frameworks. Then there's abstracting. Abstracting amounts to taking something that is in a spatiotemporal framework and ripping it out of that framework so that you can stick it in another one. He thinks that is the foundation of language. He thinks it's by abstracting that we form general ideas. So ideas are particular until we think of them out of space and time. Then they're general. So this is just the core apparatus. It's these actively constructed ideas and the mental operations that construct them that are going to be important for us, but not in fine detail, just in broad strokes. So consider this. I'm going to reconstruct an account of the Lockean mind, smoothing over a lot of the real serious difficulties in Locke's very old text. I think there's a conception in Locke of a passive mind. This passive mind is what receives stimuli. The stimuli counts as data. We'll include in that stimuli things like pain, pleasure, and all the sensations. There are a few other elements, but that's enough. There we go. In addition to that, there's the active mind. The active mind thinks about the stimulus data. The stimulus data came in from the passive mind. The active mind thinks about what the passive mind supplies, and it does so by means of those mental operations I mentioned before. It also directs bodily volition. So it's in virtue of the active mind that the mind can then engage in feedback processes with respect to stimuli. So it gets stuff in, thinks about it, and then reacts. The abstracting mind, a lot of stuff up there, a little hard to parse, but I think it's comprehensible. What it does is it takes the products of the active mind and then rips them out of their spatio-temporal relations. Those spatio-temporal relations were imposed by the active mind. The abstract mind, then, the abstracting mind, takes the ideas out of those contexts and then delivers those results right back to the active mind so we can think about them again. Okay? So there's a lot of looping feedback between the abstracting and the active mind. All of that is what's going on internally in our minds. Now, concerning the ideas that we get of mental operations by means of reflection, Locke has the following to say. Though they pass there continuously, yet, like floating visions, they make not deep impressions enough to leave in the mind clear, distinct, lasting ideas till the understanding turns inward upon itself, reflects on its own operations, and makes them the object of its own contemplation. What this means is that our mental processes of the active mind and the abstracting mind are occurring continuously, but we don't take notice of them. Instead, we take notice of what they're latching onto. So we focus on our sensory input. We think about that sensory input, but unless we do something more to turn our attention inward and focus on our mental operations, we'll continuously be immersed in the world of our senses. Locke actually thinks that it's animal intellects that are completely immersed in their senses, and their thought processes don't engage in very much reflection. That is, they think, but they don't know that they're thinking, and they don't know how they're thinking. So we have the passive mind, the active mind, and the abstracting mind. One more function. The reflectively abstracting mind. This is a higher order of abstraction. The reflectively abstracting mind abstracts ideas of the various operations of abstracting and the active mind, and then delivers those ideas back to the active mind for further processing. That's the key. The first three processes are not self-reflective, but the process of abstracting can be directed in two directions. One of them towards stimulus, and the other towards the active operations. A cognitive person does all that. A being that only has the top three of those operations is a lesser human being than a person. Locke also makes the claim that animals only engage in the top two. That's probably false, but Locke would have no ability to engage in the studies back in the 1690s to make the determination about whether animals can abstract. He makes the claim that they can't, but it's probably the case that a lot of higher primates and maybe several other mammals do engage in something like abstracting, though it's hard to actually work the data out. Then again, I don't think Locke would be bothered by that. And furthermore, suppose we found some entity that actually did reflectively abstract and there was solid data on that. Locke would just have to throw up his hands and say, well, guess what? There's another cognitive person for you. So he has no particular agenda about which things actually meet this criteria or don't. The responsible person does everything the cognitive person does, but associates pains and pleasures with what it reflectively abstracts on. Okay, now we've got some apparatus here. I want to talk a little bit about some science. Locke is very much interested in science, but wants to understand the domain of science and treat it as, let's say, rising to a standard appropriate to it, that you shouldn't hold science to a standard it can't actually meet. With respect to the business about being a person, science tells us a lot about the organism. Science directs its attention primarily to the organism. But there's also scientific studies of the cognitive processes. And there's scientific studies of what's going on just in the mind. Much of this wasn't going on in any sophisticated way in Locke's own day, but it certainly is going on today. But Locke can anticipate a great deal of this. And one point he wants to make is that to understand the person biologically, is to make claims about the causes of our thought processes. Now, if we understand those cognitive processes that I was describing in the account of a cognitive person as something that computational systems could engage in, that would be equivalent, in Locke's terms, for understanding the underlying causes of us. Whether those thought processes are in some way induced biologically, or whether they're induced computationally is a matter of the underlying causes. But Locke's whole position about what a person is causally neutral. So this additional business about whether or not a person is biologically induced or computationally induced for Locke is something that's irrelevant to anything about what it is to be a person. Focus on the computational point as well. Whether a person is computationally induced by means of processes that actually engage in that higher order abstraction, or whether a computational system is merely simulating those processes, trying to emulate the results without the actual process, that too is a claim about the underlying causes and not a claim about the effects. Persons are collections of data on Locke's account. And that means they are nothing but the effect of some underlying process that we simply don't know. So let's consider the issue about virtual cognitive persons. A virtual cognitive person, remember, is someone who would meet the criteria for being a cognitive person, but we're unsure whether that being is a bona fide person or a simulation of some sort. Okay? There's some work done in computer science to deal with how robotic systems cognize their environment and their own processes. I want to consider some of that data right now. So here's a paper by a couple of computer scientists. Take a look at the abstract for a second. We introduce a technique that allows a robot to increase its resiliency and learning skills by exploiting a process akin to self-reflection. That's, of course, allowing that it's not self-reflection. It's akin to it. A robot contains two controllers, a purely reactive innate controller and a reflective controller that can observe, model, and control the innate controller. That's analogous to the distinctions between the passive mind and the active and abstracting mind. The reflective controller adapts the innate controller without access to the innate controller's internal state or architecture. That's the novelty of this particular research. The reflective controller deals with its passive controller without knowing how it works. It has to model it. It has to form an abstract model of its own internal processes. That's the abstracting mind. Instead, it models it and then synthesizes filters that exploit its existing capabilities for new situations. In this paper, we explore a number of scenarios where the innate controller is a recurrent neural network, so this is done in simulation. We demonstrate significant adaptation ability with relatively few physical trials. A little summary of their main points. What we have here from these two figures, and this work is actually pretty recent, like from, I think, 2009, is that they're designing robots and controlling software for those robots where the robot would model its own motor functions and model its own controller. They call this a form of metacognition. What they're trying to do is induce into a robotic system the proto-conditions for being cognitive persons. They're not in any way invoking Locke as a model for what they're doing. They're actually doing this in relation to other work in psychology concerning theory of mind. Here's how that works. So again, this Hod Libson is the guy who's common to these two research projects. Take a look at the abstract here, if you can read it here. The psychology term theory of mind refers to the ability of an agent to recognize that an observed actor acts according to intentions and plans. In humans and some primates, theory of mind is fundamental to effective cooperation and competition, blah, blah, blah. The main point here that they want to do is say that they are going to use this business about cognizing over our mental processes to have a robotic system model not only its processes, but some other robotic system's processes. What that robotic mind is doing is engaging in a kind of abstraction where it models its own mind and then models other minds. And it conjures up, lots of different models and tries to select the best ones according to the available inputs. Still, that is the highest order function in Locke's account. Okay? That is what I called the reflectively abstracting mind. And so what these computer scientists are trying to do is, in very primitive robotic situations, and these ones are only in simulation, is try to produce very primitive entities with extremely few controllers. Like, they're relatively reasonably sized objects when they've actually made the robots. But what they're trying to do is have them have very few parts, but give them right away high-order cognitive functions. And in that way, try to jumpstart the move towards this process of actually becoming virtual persons. So what we have here is not only what was done in that other work, but projection to other minds as an enhancement to it. Problem is this. What you have when you have purely a cognitive mind is you have something akin to a partial description of a psychopath. So consider this as a proposal about what a psychopath might be. A true, real psychopath, a human being who's a psychopath, okay? That would be a bona fide cognitive person, but only a virtual responsible person. Let me explain that a little bit. This is someone who has all the cognitive processes to model a mind and has the cognitive processes to model other minds, but only fakes being a responsible person. Only fakes care about pain and pleasure, okay? A virtual responsible person, then, consider that to be something akin to a psychopath. The issue here isn't about whether we're actually making psychopathic robots. The issue is whether we're making robots that are modeled as psychopaths, that will function as psychopaths. Okay? Now, suppose you've got a psychopath staring you down with weaponry. Okay? How much concern are you going to engage in at that moment to determine whether it's a virtual psychopath or a bona fide psychopath? Consider that just for a moment, okay? Here's some of the descriptions in the DSM-5, which is not yet out. That's the, what's DSM stand for? Diagnostics? Statistical Manual. That's it, yeah. Now this is proposed revisions for the upcoming DSM-5 to reintroduce the notion of psychopathy back into the DSM. It had dropped out for a few editions in favor of other kinds of terms, while lots of psychologists continued to discuss psychopathic behavior, but it didn't really have, it doesn't have, let's say, a stable definition in psychology. Nevertheless, it is latched onto by people in the popular press quite a bit, and there are a number of psychiatrists studying it. But in this proposal to reintroduce it, take a look at these descriptions. What I've done here with the ellipses is basically take out everything that would have to be peculiar to a person that is a human being, but leave inside all the stuff that applies to a person who's not necessarily a human being. So, callousness and little empathy for others' needs or feelings, rights, property, or safety of others disregarded with little or no remorse or guilt if others are harmed. Little insight into the motivations of others and an impaired ability to consider alternative interpretations of experience. That particular issue is actually being overcome in some of this work with the theory of mind application. But then again, a psychopath who's better able to intuit other people's motivations is not necessarily a consolation. Impulsivity with regard for consequences and a sense of invulnerability, unlawful or unethical behavior is often pursued. In the case of a robotic system, it wouldn't be necessarily for the sake of, the thrill of being an outlaw, but instead it would just be an inevitable consequence of not giving a crap about law. Okay? Superficial charm and ingratiation may be employed to achieve certain ends, and there's a disregard for conventional moral principles, general irresponsibility. This is describing my dog. Okay. Maybe psychopaths aren't so bad. I mean, if I'm able to anticipate this kind of behavior in my dog, then the fact that my dog meets this portion of the description of being a psychopath isn't such a threat. Well, then again, my dog's that big. But if it's a bigger dog, maybe more of a physical threat, but not something that's an insurmountable problem. And the fact that there are a great deal of dangerous dogs out there that might behave like that has not led to the collapse of society. I would claim. Okay? So maybe this business about psychopaths is not something that warrants histrionics. So, okay, I want to attenuate this concern a little bit. Okay, here are some robots. Can you spot the psychopaths? Any? Is this one you recognize right here? T-1000 from Terminator 2. Do you remember that one faked people out on the phone by calling them up and talking like someone else's voice just to find where they are? And that robot, liquid metal, I don't know if you want to call it a robot, that thing, whatever it is, it's able to model other minds, and it has a very specific purpose. Okay? But don't these also do something similar to that? And suppose that they are virtual persons. At best, they would be maybe cognitive persons. We might wonder whether or not they have genuine emotions. If they lack genuine emotions, but try to fake it to be nice, oh, Master Luke, curse my metal body, I wasn't fast enough with the trash compactor, or like that, okay? If that's just a fake job to ingratiate him, with others, then that guy's a psychopath too. Okay? So you don't have to be Ed 209 to be a psychopath. Oh, let me see. I don't know if I'm going to get sound out of this. Hang on. My sound functions went away. Okay. We definitely want to hear Ed 209, don't we? Well, we won't. But anyhow, take a look at the visuals. So that guy's holding up a gun because that's a police robot. And he wants this junior executive to threaten Ed 209 with the gun. Ed 209 is then going to disarm him. There you go, holding the gun. Ed 209 tells him he only has a few seconds to comply.
To comply. I think you'd better do what he says, Mr. Kenny. You now have 15 seconds to comply. You are in direct violation of Code 113.
Presentation.
You now have 5 seconds to comply.
Very good with the targeting. Oh, they come down. There we go.
Dick, I'm very disappointed. Sure, it's only a glitch.
Okay, yeah. The main point is this. You don't have to be like Ed 209 and T-1000 to be a psychopath. Wall-E, R2-D2, and C-3PO would be virtual psychopaths if all they are doing is emulating, okay, emotional capabilities. And so there isn't any need to think that psychopathic robots amounts to being overrun by Terminators and Ed 209s. So let's think about this issue with respect to virtual persons in light of the emulation or simulation of cognitive and responsible persons' characteristics. Here's more research. These folks, this is older research, this is from way back in 2005, but what they're doing is attempting to do similar work in simulation as what Lipson and his group were doing with developing these higher order cognitive states. But what they want to do is try to fake out some emotions, okay? And in some way get an emotion agent into the system and also have that be a separate line of processing from the higher order cognitive functions. And so what they're trying to do is get to virtual responsible agents in that sense. But if that's what they're doing, they're developing psychopathic robots. They're just doing it by means of both the processes of simulation of metacognition and processes of a separate emotion agent. But there needn't be any particular reason to think that they're going to overrun us with hostile robots. As a result, they might end up developing little C-3POs. Why bring Locke back into this dispute? Well, I'm bringing back Locke, even though Locke is not particularly motivating any of that work. None of those researchers are in any way calling on Locke. The thing is that without realizing it, they're actually supplying Locke's own structures. And on that account, whatever there is in Locke's larger project, and whatever there is in the whole philosophical enterprise of trying to understand Locke's larger project, that now supplies those researchers a further context for understanding how the concepts that are relevant to their projects might be related to other things to develop future directions. So those researchers, it's not as if I'm trying to say that they need to get the blessing of some guy who's been dead for a few hundred years or of philosophers to pursue their research agenda. Hell no. My only concern on this is that since they are already interested, since those computer researchers are already interested in digging into contemporary psychological theory and using it as a guide for how to aim their studies, well, here's a larger project concerning Locke's account of a person that might be helpful in that enterprise as well. And it actually fits with Locke's general idea. This is a statement of his ambition in his whole project. "'Tis ambition enough to be employed as an under-laborer in clearing the ground a little and removing some of the rubbish that lies in the way to knowledge, which certainly had been very much more advanced in the world if the endeavors of ingenious and industrious men have not been much cumbered with the learned but frivolous youth of uncouth, affected, or unintelligible terms introduced into the sciences, and there made an art of to that degree that philosophy, which is nothing but the true knowledge of things, was thought unfit or incapable to be brought into well-bred company and polite conversation." So I'm thinking that this concept of a virtual person, and especially its cognate forms like the virtual responsible person, and on that account, the understanding of these robotic agents as potentially psychopathic, needn't be too much of a threat if we understand how they fit within Locke's cognitive structures. And so maybe this whole notion of a virtual person just amounts to rubbish that lies in the way of the sciences, and a little bit of philosophy can at least sweep away that problem. So, thank you.